The first thing I remember is the smell. Not the flowers, not the perfume of grieving relatives, but the heavy, suffocating scent of incense that seemed to crawl into my lungs and settle there. It was the kind of smell that makes you feel like you are breathing in someone else's secrets, old and stale, clinging to every surface of the room. The church was filled with lilies and roses, arranged beautifully, yet nothing about that moment felt beautiful. Every petal, every candle, every whispered prayer seemed staged, like we were all part of a theater production where no one really understood the script. The air carried an unnatural weight, as if silence itself had grown fangs. People spoke in low voices, but those whispers did not comfort anyone. They only deepened the unease. I noticed eyes darting around the room, people pretending to focus on their own grief while secretly scanning others, as though waiting for a cue or perhaps for something to unravel. The coffin stood at the center, closed tight, a dark wooden box that demanded attention without offering answers. It was the one object that everyone came to see, and yet no one dared to truly look at. I sat in the front row, my hands clenched together so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My body shook, not just from sadness, but from a strange sensation that something about this day was profoundly wrong. It was not only the fact that my husband was gone, but the way the atmosphere seemed to whisper that maybe he was not. Have you ever felt a chill in the middle of a crowded room? The kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature, but everything to do with dread? That is exactly what wrapped itself around me like an invisible chain. Behind me, I could hear the restless shifting of relatives. My daughter's quiet sobs mixed with the hollow cough of a distant cousin. Yet even their grief sounded forced, like people trying to mimic what they thought grief should look like. There was no authenticity in their tears. Their faces were pale masks, and I realized with a jolt that I could not tell who was truly mourning and who was simply performing. That thought burrowed itself deep inside me, planting the seed of suspicion that would only grow stronger as the day dragged on. I tried to focus on the priest's voice, but his words slipped through me like smoke. He spoke of peace, of eternal rest, of forgiveness, but each phrase landed with a dull thud in my chest. Forgiveness for what? Peace for whom? My husband had been a complicated man, someone who lived behind locked doors of his own making. Now those doors were sealed forever, and the silence felt heavier than any sermon could explain. Every detail of the setting seemed exaggerated, almost mocking. The candles flickered too violently, as though agitated by a breath no one else could feel. The wooden pews creaked as people shifted, though no one seemed to move enough to cause the sound. Even the clock above the altar ticked louder than it should, counting down each second as though daring us all to endure the weight of time. As I stared at the coffin, I could not help but wonder why it remained closed. They told me it was for the best, that he had suffered too much, that the sight would be unbearable. But in truth, that explanation never satisfied me. What did they not want me to see? What face were they hiding from me? My hands trembled against my lap, nails digging into skin, as if pressing harder would anchor me to reality. Grief has a strange way of reshaping perception. At first, I thought my mind was simply playing tricks, bending under the pressure of loss. But as the ceremony continued, I noticed subtle things that confirmed my unease. The absence of certain friends who should have been there. The nervous glance exchanged between my brother-in-law and one of the pallbearers. The way my daughter kept avoiding my eyes, as if she feared I would ask her a question she could not answer. It was like everyone in that room was keeping a secret, and I was the only one left outside of it. My body reacted before my mind could. My heart raced, my throat dried, and the pounding in my temples made it hard to think clearly. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand the coffin be opened right then and there. But instead I stayed silent, paralyzed by the possibility that opening it might confirm a truth more horrifying than death itself. Because death is final, but deception is endless. In moments like these, memories attack you in waves. They do not come gently, they crash and suffocate. I saw flashes of our life together, dinners shared, arguments muffled behind closed doors, his hand gripping mine when he wanted me to stay quiet. Each memory seemed distorted under this new light, as if I had spent years looking at a painting that now revealed an entirely different image beneath the surface. It was terrifying to realize that grief might not be the heaviest thing I was carrying. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, though I could not make out the words. They all blurred into one indistinct hum, a sound that only deepened the sense that something was about to happen, something that none of us could stop. My body leaned forward unconsciously, my breath shallow, my mind caught between wanting to run and needing to know. That is when my grandson's hand found mine, small but steady, pulling me back into the present. His eyes, wide and intense, locked onto mine with a force far greater than a child should possess. In that gaze, I felt both comfort and dread, as if he carried a knowledge too heavy for his years. And as he leaned closer, the world around me blurred, the flowers, the whispers, the candles, all fading into insignificance. His lips parted, and his words would soon shatter the fragile boundary between mourning and terror, leaving me to question not only my husband's death, but everything I thought I knew about the life we had lived together. If this story left you speechless or gave you chills, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what part surprised you the most, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next thrilling tale. His voice was barely audible, almost swallowed by the weight of the silence around us, yet it cut through me sharper than any scream could have. My grandson's lips brushed my ear as he whispered, and I felt every syllable sink into my skin like ice. He is alive, and he will take his revenge. For a moment I could not move, my body locked in place as though my bones themselves refused to process what I had just heard. The room spun in slow circles, and the edges of the world blurred. I had come prepared to bury my husband, to mourn him, to release the heavy grief that had been building inside me for days. Instead, I was being pulled into a nightmare that made death seem merciful. I turned my head instinctively, searching his young face for signs of mischief or confusion, but his eyes told me something different, wide, steady, unwavering. Children sometimes speak nonsense at funerals. They repeat things they overhear or invent stories to fill the silence. But there was no playfulness in him. His gaze carried the kind of conviction that does not belong to a child. It was the look of someone who knows too much and has chosen the exact moment to let it slip. My throat tightened as if invisible hands had wrapped themselves around it. I tried to whisper back, to ask what he meant, but my words died before they left my lips. How could I, in the middle of a funeral, with a coffin at the center of the room, question a child about the possibility that the man we were burying was not dead at all? The very thought sounded absurd, yet it clung to me with such ferocity that I could not dismiss it. I replayed the whisper again and again in my mind, examining each word. Alive. Revenge. The first destroyed the logic of everything in front of me. The second poisoned my veins with fear. If he was alive, where was he? And if he truly sought revenge, against whom would it fall? The room suddenly seemed full of suspects. I scanned the faces around me, and every relative, every neighbor, every friend became a potential target. My grief mutated into paranoia, and it terrified me how natural that transformation felt. The boy squeezed my hand tighter, as if he could sense the earthquake he had triggered in me. That grip told me he wanted me to believe him, and I did. Against reason, against tradition, against the sight of that closed coffin, I believed him. Something in my bones, in the deepest recesses of instinct, told me he was not lying. Perhaps it was the eerie calmness in his tone, or the way his pupils dilated, as though he were reliving a memory he wished he could forget. Whatever it was, it carved itself into my soul. I tried to pull my attention back to the ceremony, to the priest's monotone voice reciting prayers of eternal rest, but each word now sounded hollow. How could I pray for the rest of a man who might still be walking this earth? The words felt false, as though the entire ritual was a cover for something else, a distraction to keep us from asking the wrong questions. My stomach churned, a sickness growing in me that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fear of the unknown. In the back of my mind, I began to connect fragments of moments I had dismissed before. My husband's cryptic warnings about enemies, his habit of locking doors inside his own home, the way he sometimes disappeared for hours without explanation. At the time, I accepted those things as eccentricities, the flaws of a complicated man. But what if they were breadcrumbs leading to a truth I had refused to see? What if my grandson's whisper was not a child's fantasy, but the final piece of a puzzle I had ignored for too long? I wanted to question him right there, to demand he explain himself. But how could I interrogate a child in the middle of a funeral, surrounded by the echo of prayers and the watchful eyes of relatives? Instead, I sat frozen, my lips sealed, my mind screaming. The boy's face remained calm, almost unnervingly so, as if delivering this revelation had lifted a weight off his small shoulders. It was I who now carried the burden, trembling under the impossible truth. The coffin suddenly felt like a trap. My heart pounded with the urge to rise and demand it be opened, to see with my own eyes the body inside. Yet fear anchored me to the pew. What if it was empty? What if what I saw only confirmed that my grandson's words were true? The uncertainty was worse than the grief had ever been. Grief, at least, has an ending. But doubt has no finish line. It grows, feeds, multiplies, until it consumes everything. My ears picked up details I had not noticed before. The faint hum of someone humming a tune under their breath, though no one seemed aware of it. The creak of wood, though no one had moved. The shifting of shadows across the coffin, though the candles had not flickered. Each sound amplified my dread, each detail twisting reality further out of shape. My mind screamed at me to remain calm, but my body betrayed me with every shaky breath. I looked again at my grandson and realized he was not trembling at all. His face was pale but steady, and in his stillness there was something hauntingly familiar. A calmness I had seen before in my husband when he spoke of matters no one else was meant to hear. That realization struck me like lightning. Had my grandson inherited more than his grandfather's eyes? Had he inherited his secrets too? The more I stared at him, the more convinced I became that he knew far more than he was letting on. Children often absorb things we overlook. They hear conversations behind closed doors, they notice patterns we dismiss, and sometimes they are trusted with truths because adults believe they will not understand. But children do understand, and they carry those truths like fragile glass in their hands. My grandson's whisper was not the babble of innocence. It was a confession, a fragment of a secret too dangerous to say aloud in daylight. I sat motionless, torn between the urge to press him for more and the terror of what his answers might unleash. The thought that my husband's death might be nothing more than a carefully staged illusion clawed at me from within. If he had orchestrated this, if he had managed to deceive an entire family, an entire community, then he was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And if revenge truly drove him, then none of us were safe. The priest's voice grew louder as he raised his hands in blessing, but his words drowned beneath the echo of my grandson's whisper. That single sentence had rewritten the entire day, reshaped the meaning of every tear and every prayer. I could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Around me, people continued to grieve, oblivious, but I knew with absolute certainty that the truth was now loose in the room, invisible but unstoppable. And as my grandson's fingers clung to mine, I understood that life as I knew it had ended the moment he spoke those words. Nothing was certain anymore. Not death, not loyalty, not even the bonds of family. I was left with the unbearable suspicion that the coffin before me did not mark the end of a story, but the beginning of one far darker, one in which every person I loved could be caught in a storm I could neither predict nor control. What do you think really happened in this story? Drop your theories and reactions in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more mysterious and captivating stories every week. Memories are strange things. They lie in wait, silent and harmless, until a single word or a fleeting look awakens them, reshaping them into something unrecognizable. That whisper from my grandson became a knife that sliced open the fabric of my past, forcing me to re-examine everything I thought I knew about my marriage. In the blur of grief, what should have been moments of comfort turned into fragments of suspicion. Every smile I once cherished, every absence I dismissed, every excuse I accepted, suddenly appeared coated in doubt. I remembered the late nights when the phone rang and he would step out into the cold, his voice low and hurried, claiming it was work. I had believed him because believing was easier than questioning. I remembered the trips he said were conferences or business meetings, but he always returned with no souvenirs, no receipts, no stories to share. I told myself he was a private man, a little secretive, but nothing unusual. Now, in the silence of the funeral, those memories burned like evidence I had foolishly ignored. There were moments when the veil had almost slipped. Once, I caught him staring at the window long after midnight, his jaw tight, his shoulders rigid. When I asked what was wrong, he brushed it off, saying he was just thinking. Thinking of what? I never dared to press. Another time, he came home with a bruise on his cheek and a cut across his knuckles. He laughed when I asked, saying he had slipped while fixing the car. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But deep down, something in his eyes told me it was not the full truth. What disturbed me most were the gaps. Whole weekends where he claimed to be traveling for work, but left no trace of his destination. Receipts missing from his wallet, pockets of his jackets strangely empty as though carefully checked before he walked through the door. There was a pattern in the emptiness, but I never connected the dots because to do so would have meant admitting that I was living beside a stranger. I began to wonder if all marriages carry secrets like these, small lies that build up into walls so high you cannot see what lies behind them. Perhaps other wives share my blindness, mistaking silence for peace and absence for duty. But the whisper of my grandson shattered that fragile illusion. It told me I had not been blind by chance. I had been blinded deliberately. He had cultivated my trust as a shield, protecting a second life I was never meant to uncover. I thought back to our anniversaries. Simple dinners, modest gifts, gestures that seemed genuine. Yet I could not ignore the hollow ring of his promises, how he always diverted conversations when I asked about his youth, his past jobs, his family before me. I used to think he was avoiding pain. Now I realized he was hiding something else entirely. His past was not a scar, it was a weapon, and he wielded it with silence. Even his affection, which once warmed me, felt different under this new light. The way he held my hand in public was always firm, too firm, as if to remind me who had control. The way he kissed my forehead instead of my lips felt less like love and more like ritual. Small details that once comforted me now appeared like rehearsed performances. Gestures learned to keep me docile, convinced, loyal. The most painful part of this revelation was realizing how complicit I had been in maintaining the illusion. I told myself I was a good wife for not prying, for trusting him without question. I believed silence was respect, when in truth it was submission. I kept his secrets safe without even knowing what they were. And now those secrets were rising from the grave, breathing life into the suspicion that he might not be dead at all. When I looked around the funeral hall, I wondered how many others knew. Were the sideways glances of my relatives really signs of grief, or were they signs of knowledge they dared not speak? Did they see me as the last to know, the fool who had lived in the house but never inside the truth? Shame crept into my grief, twisting my sorrow into humiliation. It was unbearable to sit there, knowing that my grandson's whisper might only confirm what others had suspected all along. I remembered something odd from just weeks before his death. He had left the house with a small suitcase, saying he was going to meet a client. When he returned the next morning, his clothes were pressed, his shoes polished, as though he had never traveled at all. I asked where he had gone, and he smiled, kissed my cheek, and told me not to worry. Those words, "Do not worry," echoed in my ears now like a cruel joke. Every time he told me not to worry, it was because there was something terrible to hide. The truth of a marriage is not only in its vows, but in its silences. And now, drowning in silence, I began to see the shape of the man I had lived with for decades. He was not just secretive. He was orchestrating something far bigger than I could have imagined. My grandson's words did not feel like fantasy. They felt like confirmation. My husband had left behind a trail of riddles, and all of them pointed to a man who had never truly belonged to me. I pressed my palms together, trying to steady my breathing, but my chest ached with the weight of unanswered questions. If he had lived two lives, then what role had I played in them? Was I a cover, a shield, a convenient mask for the world to see? The thought that my marriage had been nothing more than a facade was more devastating than death itself. Death robs you of the person. Lies rob you of the very memories you built with them. As the priest's voice echoed in the background, I could no longer hear the words of Scripture. All I heard was the repetition of my grandson's whisper colliding with the sudden clarity of my past. Every moment of my marriage had been rewritten in that instant, transformed from love into deception, from trust into manipulation. And as the weight of it all pressed down on me, I realized that grief had given way to something even more consuming. It was not mourning I felt anymore. It was the desperate need to uncover what had truly been hiding behind the man I thought I knew. I'd love to know your thoughts on this story. Comment below with what shocked you or what you would have done in this situation, and hit subscribe to join us for the next suspenseful journey. I used to tell myself that my husband was a quiet man, a man who carried his past with dignity and kept his struggles to himself. But when the whisper of my grandson cracked open the fragile shell of that illusion, I realized that his silence was not about dignity at all. It was concealment. Every unanswered question, every vague excuse, every unfinished story now loomed in my mind as part of something carefully designed. And as I traced the contours of his life with the eyes of suspicion, I began to see that the man I thought I had loved was perhaps only one mask in a collection he had worn for decades. There were fragments of conversations I had overheard through the years, pieces I dismissed at the time, men with sharp voices who called him late at night, always speaking in codes, always hanging up as soon as I entered the room. I remember once hearing him whisper the word debt in a tone that was not financial, but almost threatening, as though the debt was measured not in money, but in blood. I told myself he must have been stressed about business, but business never explained the darkness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Some stories about him never added up. People who claimed to have known him in his youth contradicted each other. One old friend said they had worked together in construction. Another insisted they had met during a stint in the military. Both could not be true. When I asked him directly, he would smile that calm smile and say that memory was a tricky thing, that people invent histories for themselves. It sounded profound at the time, like something a man with wisdom would say. Now it felt like a warning. Perhaps he was speaking of himself. I often wondered why he never kept photographs of his past. Our home was filled with family portraits after our wedding, pictures of our children, birthdays and holidays. But there was not a single photo of him as a child, as a teenager, or even as a young adult before we met. He told me once that all the pictures had been lost in a house fire. I accepted that explanation, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a convenient erasure. Who was he before me? Who was I sharing my bed with if the first chapter of his life had been wiped clean like chalk from a board? I remembered how strangers sometimes looked at him with too much recognition. Once in the market, a man passed us and froze, staring at my husband with wide eyes before quickly turning away. When I asked who he was, my husband dismissed it as someone mistaking him for another. Yet the way his jaw clenched afterward betrayed something more. Another time, while we were dining at a small restaurant, the waiter's hands shook when he approached our table. He called my husband sir in a tone that was neither casual nor polite, but filled with an undercurrent of fear. My husband tipped generously and left in silence, and we never returned to that place again. I began to think about his habits, the strange rituals that once seemed harmless. He always sat with his back against the wall in any public space, his eyes scanning every face in the room as though memorizing escape routes. He disliked surprises, growing tense whenever someone approached without warning. And he never allowed anyone to touch his briefcase. It was always locked, always within reach, even when he slept. Once, when I jokingly tried to carry it for him, his reaction was so sharp, so out of proportion, that I never touched it again. As the pieces aligned in my memory, I realized that he had not just been secretive. He had been building an identity out of shadows. His life with me was not a whole truth, but a partial one, constructed carefully to hide the rest. He was a man who could smile at the dinner table, kiss his children goodnight, and at the same time carry a darkness that none of us were invited to see. The duality was terrifying. It was as if two versions of him had existed all along, one that belonged to the family and another that belonged to secrets I could not name. What frightened me most was the possibility that he had enemies. Real enemies. I remembered a night when we were driving home and he suddenly ordered me to take a different route, claiming there was traffic. His tone was urgent, his eyes darting to the mirrors, but I did not see a single car behind us. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, maybe paranoid. Now, I wondered if someone had been following us. If his life had truly been entangled in dangerous affairs, then those dangers had been closer to us than I dared to realize. The thought that he could still be alive was horrifying, but not because of the miracle it implied. It was horrifying because of what it revealed about who he had been all along. A man capable of faking his death is a man capable of anything. If my grandson was right, then my husband had walked away from this funeral not as a victim, but as an architect, watching from the shadows as we wept over an empty coffin. That possibility made my skin crawl. I felt betrayed not just as a wife, but as a human being who had trusted in the most sacred bond of intimacy. A marriage is supposed to be a union of truths, but ours had been a performance. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my role had never been that of a partner. I had been the cover story, the camouflage that allowed him to disappear into respectability while hiding his darker pursuits. The home we built together was not a sanctuary, but a stage. The silence around me in the funeral hall thickened as these realizations crashed down. The prayers blurred into meaningless sound, the faces of mourners faded, and all I could feel was the weight of his hidden life pressing against my chest. If everything I had believed was a fabrication, then the man I loved never truly existed. He had been a ghost long before this day, and I had been in love with a ghost all along. And yet, beneath the grief and betrayal, another thought pulsed like a drumbeat. If he had lived a life in the shadows, if he had built an existence out of lies and half-truths, then those shadows had not vanished with the closing of a coffin. They were still out there, alive, waiting, and perhaps watching me now. There was something unsettling about the way my grandson had spoken, something that lingered long after his whisper had dissolved into the air. Children are supposed to tremble at funerals, to cry, to fidget with the boredom of rituals they do not understand. But he had not trembled, nor had he cried. His face had been steady, his hand warm and certain around mine, his words deliberate. It was not the voice of innocence, but of someone carrying a weight far too heavy for his age. And that disturbed me more than anything. He had always shared a special bond with his grandfather, a closeness that bordered on secretive. While the other grandchildren ran through the garden chasing one another, he preferred to sit by the old man's side, listening to stories that seemed too grim for a child, but which he absorbed with fascination. I often overheard fragments. Tales of men who disappeared without explanation, of betrayals that ended in blood, of debts paid not with money, but with silence. When I scolded my husband for filling the boy's head with such darkness, he only smiled and said, "He is stronger than you think." I thought it was just his way of justifying bad judgment. Now I wondered if those stories had not been entertainment at all, but veiled confessions disguised as bedtime tales. There were nights when I would find them together in the study, the grandfather's voice low, the boy leaning in as if being initiated into a secret. I never pressed too hard to know what they were discussing. Perhaps it was easier to imagine they were talking about fishing or chess than to confront the possibility that my husband was planting seeds of his hidden world into our grandson's young mind. What could he have been teaching him? To keep silent? To recognize danger? To never trust appearances? The boy often repeated his grandfather's phrases as though they were sacred scripture. Once, when I asked him why he did not tell me about a broken vase in the living room, he replied calmly, "Some truths are not meant for everyone." He was only 10 years old. At the time, I laughed nervously and told myself children repeat anything they hear. But the way he said it, with such composure, unsettled me. It was not mimicry. It was conviction. And there were other strange moments. The way he sometimes knew where his grandfather had been before even I did. He would say things like, "Grandpa is not at work today. He is watching someone." Or, "Grandpa does not like that man. He is dangerous." When I asked how he knew such things, he would shrug as if it was obvious. I dismissed it as childish imagination, the way young minds stitch together fragments of overheard words into elaborate fantasies. Yet his fantasies often aligned too closely with realities I only discovered later. I began to recall how much the boy resembled his grandfather, not just in appearance, but in manner. He had the same piercing way of observing people, studying them silently as though peeling back their layers. He never interrupted conversations, but listened intently, storing details others missed. At family gatherings, while the other children giggled, he watched, always watching. I used to think it was simply shyness, but now I wondered if it was training. There is a cruelty in the thought that a man might choose his grandson as a vessel for his secrets, as though preparing the child to carry forward something unfinished. But the more I thought about it, the more it explained the calmness in the boy's whisper, the certainty in his eyes. He was not speculating that his grandfather was alive. He was remembering. He had known something long before the rest of us. Perhaps he had been entrusted with knowledge I could never have been trusted to handle. And why him? Why not his own children, his wife, his closest friends? Why give the torch of secrets to a child? The answer became clear with chilling simplicity. Children are underestimated. No one suspects them. No one questions them. They can carry messages, witness things, repeat words, and no one pays attention because they are dismissed as imaginative or naive. A child can hold more truth than an adult precisely because no one believes them capable of holding it. My heart ached as I realized the burden my grandson might be carrying. He was too young to carry the weight of lies, too young to hold the darkness of another man's sins. Yet his steady gaze told me he had already accepted it. That was the most terrifying thing of all, the acceptance. He did not look troubled or confused when he whispered to me. He looked resigned, as though he had long known this moment would come. I began to wonder how many nights my husband had used that calm, paternal voice to feed him pieces of his hidden life, lessons cloaked as stories, warnings disguised as wisdom. Perhaps the boy had not only inherited his grandfather's blood, but also his shadow. And if that was true, then I was sitting next to a child who already understood far too well that death was not always the end and that vengeance did not die with the body. I wanted to ask him questions, to shake him, to demand he tell me everything he knew. But the words froze in my throat. What if he told me the truth? What if the truth shattered me even more than the lie of death had? My grandson's small hand in mine felt steady, but beneath it pulsed a current of knowledge that separated us, making him feel older than his years, older even than me. And in that moment, I knew with certainty that the bond he had shared with his grandfather had been more than affection. It had been an initiation, and I was the outsider who had never been invited in. The weight of that realization pressed down on me like the coffin at the front of the room. It was not only my husband who had lived a double life, it was my grandson who now held the keys to it. And as I sat there, crushed by grief and fear, I understood that the secrets between grandfather and grandson might not have been buried at all, but were alive, breathing, and waiting to be unleashed. The longer I sat in that suffocating room, the more the air thickened with something I could not name. It was not just grief. Grief is heavy but honest. This was different, like invisible threads pulling people into silence, weaving a fabric of secrets too dangerous to touch. I began to look around, not with the eyes of a mourning wife, but with the sharpened vision of suspicion. And suddenly every face seemed foreign. My daughter sat a few rows back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes never met mine. She wept, yes, but her tears seemed too controlled, as if rehearsed. The sobs rose and fell at precise moments, like a performance meant to convince the audience of her role as grieving daughter. She had always been close to her father, perhaps closer than I realized, and now I wondered if she knew more than she dared reveal. Was she mourning him, or was she mourning the collapse of whatever pact they had shared? The thought made my skin crawl. Next to her sat my son-in-law, his face carved into an expression of stone. While others shifted with unease, he remained perfectly still, arms crossed, jaw tight. His stillness was not strength, it was calculation. He watched the room the way a guard watches a prison yard, measuring movements, noting alliances. When his eyes flicked toward me, They did not hold comfort or sympathy. They held something colder, something that warned me to keep my questions locked inside. I had seen that look before on men who wanted obedience without asking for it out loud. Around the edges of the hall, cousins whispered to one another in clusters, their heads tilted close, their voices low enough to be mistaken for prayers. Yet their eyes betrayed them. They glanced too often toward the coffin, then away, as if fearing it might expose them. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. The language of fear is universal. They were not whispering about grief. They were whispering about survival. I began to notice patterns I had overlooked before. My husband's brothers had not come. They had sent polite excuses about travel and health, but these men who had once toasted beside him at family gatherings now found reasons to vanish at his funeral. That absence was louder than any presence. It spoke of unfinished business, of debts unpaid, of grudges too dangerous to resurface in public. If he truly was alive, perhaps they feared he might be watching, tallying who dared show their face. Everywhere I looked, I saw signs of complicity. The way the priest avoided certain words, keeping his homily short and generic, as though careful not to speak anything that might anger the dead if he were still among the living. The way my nephew kept glancing at the door, his leg bouncing nervously, as though waiting for someone unexpected to enter. The way the neighbor who had known us for decades sat in the corner, lips pressed tightly together, her eyes darting away whenever I looked in her direction. None of it felt like coincidence. Even the silence of the younger children struck me as strange. Children cry at funerals. They ask questions. They tug at their parents for attention. But here, they sat unusually quiet, their little bodies pressed against their mothers, their wide eyes scanning the adults as if sensing that this was not a day for mischief, but for fear. Children can feel tension long before they understand it, and the tension in that room was thick enough to choke them. I tried to recall the last days before his supposed death. He had been quieter than usual, disappearing into long stretches of thought, his phone always at his side. I remembered one night when he spoke in hushed tones in the backyard, pacing with urgency, unaware that I was watching from the kitchen window. When he returned, he was pale, but oddly calm, as if a plan had been sealed. Perhaps the family knew of that plan. Perhaps they were all unwilling participants in the theater of his disappearance. I could not shake the sense that I was the only one who had been truly left in the dark. My daughter's evasive gaze, my son-in-law's cold control, the cousin's whispers, the priest's restraint, the children's silence, all of it pointed toward a collective knowledge that excluded me. They were not simply grieving. They were hiding something, protecting something, and I was the outsider, the fool who had lived under the same roof, yet understood the least. The betrayal cut deeper than the coffin in front of me. Grief tells you that you have lost someone you loved. Betrayal tells you that you never really had them in the first place. My life, my marriage, my family now seemed like a house built on quicksand, beautiful on the surface, but collapsing underneath. I wondered how many of them had shared pieces of his hidden life, how many had benefited from it, how many had kept their silence not out of ignorance, but out of loyalty. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor snapped me from my thoughts. My daughter had risen, her shoulders shaking as she walked quickly toward the back of the hall, her face buried in her hands. Was it grief that drove her away, or guilt? I stared after her, my heart hammering with the realization that I could no longer tell the difference. The people I once trusted most were now strangers, cloaked in masks of sorrow, and behind those masks, I could feel the weight of secrets pressing against the walls, waiting to break free. That night when the funeral ended and the mourners returned to their homes, I stepped into a house that no longer felt like mine. The walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper, every creak of the floorboards sharper against the silence. I had lived in this place for years, yet suddenly it felt foreign, as though someone else had been living there all along, and I was just a guest, stumbling into their carefully arranged stage. The weight of my grandson's words still pressed against me, but now they seemed to echo in every corner of the house. I walked slowly through the living room, and something immediately unsettled me. The photograph of our wedding that had always rested on the mantel was gone. I knew it had been there the morning before, but now the space where it belonged was bare. leaving behind only the faint imprint of dust around its edges. I tried to convince myself that someone had moved it while cleaning, perhaps one of my relatives tidying before the guests arrived. But deep inside, I knew no one had dared touch that photo for years. It was a relic, untouchable. Its absence now screamed louder than its presence ever had. When I reached the study, the smell hit me first. Cigarette smoke. Fresh, sharp, impossible to mistake. My husband had quit years ago, or at least that was what he told me. None of us smoked, and yet the air was thick with the acrid sting of burnt tobacco. My throat tightened as I noticed the ashtray on the desk, a faint smear of gray clinging to its rim. My hand trembled as I touched it, and the ash crumbled beneath my finger like fragile bone. Someone had been here, not long ago. The desk drawer that he always kept locked was slightly ajar. That drawer had been a forbidden space, a boundary in our marriage I never dared cross. Now it yawned open, inviting me into a secret I had not been meant to see. Inside, papers were scattered as if someone had rifled through them in haste. Receipts with dates from weeks after his supposed death. A bank statement showing withdrawals from an account I had never heard of. A key with no label, heavy and cold in my palm. My breath caught as I realized these were not remnants of a dead man, but traces of one still moving, still plotting, still connected to the world he had supposedly left behind. I stumbled back, clutching the key, and nearly tripped over a pair of shoes by the door. They were his. Not old shoes covered in dust, but polished, clean, with faint traces of fresh mud along the sole. I remembered those shoes because I had polished them myself not long ago. Seeing them there now, waiting, as though for someone to step back into them, sent a chill through me so deep I could barely stand. I forced myself upstairs, telling myself I was being paranoid, that grief was twisting reality into hallucinations. But when I entered our bedroom, the illusion of safety collapsed entirely. The wardrobe door hung open, and I saw immediately that several of his favorite shirts were missing. Not folded neatly away, not donated or packed, but gone, pulled from their hangers. My knees weakened as I imagined him dressing in them now, somewhere beyond the walls of this house, alive, walking among us with plans unknown. The night dragged on with no rest. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow threatening. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise at the back of the house. It was not the groan of old wood or the rattle of wind against glass. It was deliberate, a latch clicking, a floorboard bending. I froze, heart pounding, my body heavy with dread. For a moment, I thought he had returned, slipping silently through the door, watching me, testing if I was strong enough to endure his presence. But when I gathered the courage to move, the kitchen was empty, the door still locked. Only the faint outline of a muddy footprint lingered near the threshold, proof that someone had been there and had not wished to be seen. In the days that followed, the evidence grew more undeniable. His bank card, deactivated after his death, showed activity at an ATM miles away. A neighbor mentioned seeing a man who looked like him walking near the old railway station at dusk. And one morning, on the dining table, I found a folded scrap of paper bearing his handwriting, a single word scrawled in the center: wait. The letters were jagged, written quickly, but there was no mistaking them. I had seen that handwriting on birthday cards, shopping lists, notes left on the fridge. The dead do not leave messages. The more I uncovered, the more suffocating the house became. It was as if every room was pulsing with his presence, every object waiting to betray me with proof that he was not gone. I began to move through the house like a stranger, afraid to touch anything, afraid of what revelation might come next. The truth was closing in around me, not in bursts of clarity, but in whispers and fragments, building a cage of dread that left no escape. My grandson's whisper no longer felt like a warning. It felt like confirmation. The missing photograph, the cigarette ash, the open drawer, the shoes, the missing shirts, the footprint, the bank card, the note. Each clue was a thread weaving into a single truth I could not deny. My husband was out there, somewhere, alive and watching. And the thought that he was near, close enough to enter our home unnoticed, left me trembling with the realization that the coffin had never been the end, but the beginning of something far darker. Whispers about his past had always circulated, but I had treated them like gossip, the kind of small-town poison that drips into conversations when people have nothing better to do. Yet once the first cracks of doubt began to spread, I could no longer ignore them. Every story, every rumor, every hushed conversation I once dismissed now returned with terrifying clarity. My husband had not been an ordinary man. He had carried violence with him like a second skin, hiding it beneath charm and silence, but never letting it go. There was the time a neighbor hinted that my husband had been involved in a brawl years before I met him. It had not been the kind of bar fight that ends with bruises and apologies. The story spoke of broken bones, of a man who vanished afterward and was never seen again. When I asked my husband about it, he laughed in that calm, dismissive way of his and said that people like to invent legends about men who worked with their hands. At the time, I accepted his explanation. Now the laughter I remembered sounded hollow, rehearsed, a performance to bury something darker. Other stories clung to him like smoke. A cousin once warned me that my husband had enemies, though he refused to say who. A former colleague told me that my husband had walked away from a business deal that ended in disaster for everyone else involved, yet somehow he escaped untouched. People who got too close to him seemed to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, like pieces removed from a board, until only he remained. And I began to wonder if his survival was not coincidence, but design. Even his habits now appeared in a new light. He kept cash hidden in envelopes around the house, tucked into books, beneath floorboards, even once behind the lining of a coat. I used to think it was paranoia, a fear of banks or taxes. But cash is power, silent and untraceable. It is the kind of resource a man keeps ready, not for convenience, but for escape. And then there were the weapons. Not openly displayed, but I had found a knife once, sharp and heavy, hidden behind canned goods in the pantry. When I asked him about it, he claimed it was for protection. Protection from what, I had wondered, though I never dared ask again. Looking back, I remembered nights when he came home with blood on his shirt. He explained it away with careless excuses. A cut at work, a scraped hand, a dog bite. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was unthinkable. But blood has a language of its own, and once you have seen enough of it, you learn to recognize its truth. His explanations had been nothing more than stories to keep me blind. The violence was not always physical. There was a cruelty in his silences, in the way he could hold a stare so long it made even strong men falter. I had seen it at family gatherings, when an argument rose, and he simply fixed his gaze on someone until their words crumbled into nothing. It was power, raw and undeniable, and he carried it with ease. That same gaze, I now realized, was what had drawn people to fear him even when he said nothing at all. I remembered a night years ago when a stranger came to our door. His clothes were torn, his face pale, his hands trembling. He asked for my husband. When I said he was not home, the man's eyes filled with terror, and he muttered something about a debt, about promises broken. He left quickly, disappearing into the darkness before I could stop him. When I told my husband later, he grew still, his jaw tightening, and then he told me never to mention it again. That moment had seemed strange, but forgettable. Now it rose like a warning that I had ignored. The stories did not just come from strangers. My own mother once warned me that something about him unsettled her. She said he had a shadow around him, the kind that men acquire when they have lived through things they never speak of. I dismissed her words as superstition, the ramblings of an older woman too cautious about the unknown. But mothers see what daughters refuse to. She had seen the darkness long before I did, and I had chosen to cover it with love. Even the police had brushed against his past. Once, 2 officers arrived at our home asking questions about a missing man. They never accused him directly, but their eyes lingered too long, their tone too careful. When they left, my husband told me they were only fishing for rumors, that he had nothing to do with it. Yet that night, he burned papers in the backyard, standing silently by the fire until the last ember died. I had watched from the kitchen window, telling myself it was only business documents. Now I knew better. The more I pieced together, the more the picture became undeniable. My husband had not been a victim of circumstance. He had been an architect of violence, moving through life with deliberate steps, erasing those who stood in his way. He had created a reputation so fearsome that people spoke of him only in whispers, and even those whispers carried the weight of warning. He was not just secretive, he was dangerous, and if he truly was still alive, then he had returned not as a man resurrected, but as a storm gathering strength. The weight of this realization crushed me. It was one thing to mourn the man I thought I knew. It was another to realize I had shared my life with someone capable of horrors I could barely imagine. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a deeper terror. Because violence does not vanish. It lingers, it festers, it waits. And if his past was built on blood and betrayal, then the future would carry the same stains. I could feel it pressing against the edges of my life, threatening to spill into everything I loved, reminding me that the deadliest secrets are the ones that refuse to stay buried. Grief is a complicated weight, but betrayal is a knife that cuts deeper and longer than any sorrow. As I sat in the stillness of our home, piecing together the fragments of my husband's life, I felt the crushing realization that I had been deceived in the most intimate way. Every memory I had cherished was now tinged with doubt. The dinners we shared, the quiet evenings in the living room, the laughter we exchanged, all of it suddenly seemed rehearsed, measured, and designed to keep me blind to the truth. I had been a willing participant in a life that was not entirely real, and that knowledge burned hotter than grief itself. I tried to recall every conversation, every gesture, and I found patterns I had ignored for decades. There were moments when his eyes lingered too long on a stranger in the street, when his smile seemed to hide amusement rather than affection, when his words were carefully chosen to mislead rather than comfort. At the time, I excused them as quirks, as harmless eccentricities of a private man. Now, they revealed themselves as deliberate acts of concealment. I had been living beside a shadow, a man who wore masks so well that even the closest people could not see through them. I thought about the way he managed our household, always insisting on control over the smallest details. The accounts, the keys, the schedules, the visitors, everything was monitored and orchestrated. I had admired his discipline, convinced that it was proof of devotion, never realizing it was a mechanism to ensure nothing escaped his scrutiny. Every routine, every instruction I followed so obediently was part of a larger plan, one I was only now beginning to understand. There were times when friends or neighbors would speak in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward him with something between awe and fear. At social gatherings, he had a way of commanding attention without raising his voice. People would hang on his words, nodding respectfully, yet there was a subtle tension in the air, a kind of quiet caution that I never noticed until now. His presence demanded compliance, not because of charisma alone, but because of a reputation carefully cultivated in shadows. The manipulation extended beyond people into the very home we shared. I remembered doors locked at odd hours, private drawers and cabinets he would guard fiercely, objects I was told never to touch. I had obeyed willingly, believing it was simply respect for his privacy. Looking back, I understood that he had built a labyrinth around himself, one that kept secrets safe and kept me obedient, blind, and trusting. I had been living in a maze of his creation without realizing it. Even his kindness had its own weight. The gestures I once saw as loving, the small notes, the carefully chosen gifts, the quiet attention were all calculated. Each smile, each touch, each moment of apparent affection was precisely timed, measured to reinforce my trust. I had mistaken calculation for care, strategy for intimacy, and now every memory of love seemed like a riddle I was only beginning to solve, each answer revealing another layer of deception. There were times when I remembered the subtle threats, the warnings that I had ignored, a glance too sharp, a comment made under the guise of humor, a sudden insistence that I stay silent about something inconsequential. At the time, I brushed them aside, believing they were trivial or imagined. But those moments had been training, rehearsals in control, small demonstrations of power that taught me obedience without confrontation. They were lessons in submission, in the silent acceptance of rules I could not see. I began to connect these threads with the whispers I had overheard over the years. Casual remarks from acquaintances, fleeting conversations, passing observations about people who had gone missing or suffered misfortune. At the time, they had seemed disconnected, coincidental, nothing more than gossip. Now, they formed a tapestry of subtle manipulation, revealing a man who had navigated life like a chessboard, anticipating moves, hiding threats, and ensuring that no one saw the full picture until it was too late. Even the things I thought I knew about him were called into question. His childhood stories, the accounts of his youth, the explanations for past conflicts, they were all incomplete, carefully shaped to create an image of a man both relatable and admirable. I had never suspected that each story was a fragment, a partial truth designed to control the narrative. My understanding of who he was had been curated, filtered, and delivered to me in precise doses, enough to keep me tethered to a false reality. The most painful realization was the depth of my own complicity. I had wanted to trust, to believe, to find comfort in the man I loved. In doing so, I had accepted a curated life, a life without full transparency, a marriage built on omission. The intimacy I thought I shared had been carefully orchestrated, and my devotion had only enabled him to maintain the illusion. I had not been naive. I had been deceived with precision, manipulated by affection, lulled into blindness by familiarity. And yet, beneath this suffocating understanding, a darker truth emerged. Deception was only part of the picture. There was intention, planning, purpose. He had orchestrated a life within a life, and now, with his death in question, I could see the magnitude of what he had controlled. Every detail of our home, our routines, our relationships had been touched by his design. And with that realization, the fear that had been simmering in the background erupted fully. The man I mourned might not be gone, and the consequences of his possible return were impossible to measure. I walked through the house, every object now suspect. A misplaced book, a door left slightly open, a drawer ajar. All became potential clues, markers of movement and presence. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even the wind brushing against the curtains seemed to carry messages I had once overlooked. The ordinary had become extraordinary, each detail now a potential key to understanding the extent of his life and influence. I realized that grief alone could no longer hold me. It was a hollow companion compared to the weight of betrayal, the shattering knowledge that the life I had built alongside him was only partially real. And with that understanding, the boundaries of fear stretched wider. I could no longer trust my memories, my interpretations, or even my senses. Each corner of the house, each shadow, each faint sound carried the possibility that he had never truly left. The deception was alive, breathing, and more dangerous than I could have imagined. The words of my grandson echoed relentlessly in my mind, repeating themselves like a drumbeat I could not escape. He had said it so calmly, so deliberately. He does not forgive. He will return. Those words had a weight that pressed down on my chest, heavier than grief, heavier than disbelief. I tried to imagine what that meant. Was it vengeance? A reckoning? Or simply a man taking back control of the life he had abandoned, or that we had believed abandoned him? The uncertainty was suffocating. I began to analyze the life we had shared with the precision of someone examining evidence. Every trip he had taken, every stranger he had met, every late-night phone call became suspect. What had seemed mundane, the errands, the business meetings, the casual outings, now appeared as movements in a meticulously orchestrated plan. The idea that he had been plotting, even subtly, left a cold shiver running down my spine. Nothing in our life together was ordinary. Every action could have had a hidden purpose, every smile a mask concealing intent. I thought of the people who might have wronged him, the old business partners, the neighbors with grudges, the strangers with scores to settle. If he were alive, had he already marked them, observing quietly from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment? And more terrifyingly, who else was in danger? Was his vengeance limited to enemies, or had it widened to include anyone connected to us? Anyone who might stand in his way? The uncertainty was a storm, its winds battering my heart and mind simultaneously. I remembered small signs I had once ignored. The way he always carried an extra set of keys, the locked drawer in his study, the phone he refused to let anyone touch. I had thought it was caution, perhaps pride, perhaps paranoia. Now, each precaution became proof of preparation. He had been ready for this moment, ready for a return that we had assumed would never come. The house itself seemed to speak of his presence. Every lock, every hidden object, every subtle shift in order and placement revealing the faint outline of a man still alive and fully aware of his environment. Even the stories he had told me, the ones that seemed harmless, now appeared as lessons in strategy. Tales of how to watch a room, how to gauge a man's intentions, how to act in ways that conceal true plans. Had he been training my grandson all along, planting the seeds of knowledge to guide or protect him? Or had it been a more sinister education, teaching him the art of calculation, of observation, of patience for the right moment? The thought was both fascinating and terrifying. I began to notice that the ordinary things in the house were no longer neutral. A book lying open on the floor could be a signal. The arrangement of chairs in the living room could indicate who had entered, who had left, who had been watched. Even the clock on the wall, ticking in measured seconds, seemed to mark the passing of plans and not merely time. Each detail, once mundane, now carried the weight of potential strategy, a hidden language only he might fully understand. The fear became physical, a tightening in my chest, a tremor in my hands. I checked doors, windows, and locks, yet every secure place felt fragile. The sense of being observed did not come from a single glance or a sudden noise. It was in the very air, in the rhythm of shadows shifting across the walls, in the silence that pressed down heavier than the furniture around me. It was the feeling that something could appear at any moment, deliberate, and unstoppable. I recalled moments when I had sensed his control without realizing it. The way he had always predicted responses before anyone spoke. The way arguments dissolved with just a look. The way his mere presence seemed to command attention and obedience. Those traits had seemed quirks of personality. Now they revealed themselves as tools of preparation, skills refined over decades for a purpose I could barely imagine. If he was alive, all those tools were still intact, still sharpened, still lethal. Even the people who had claimed to be loyal seemed unreliable under this new lens. Who among our friends and family would have known the truth? Who would have dared to speak? I imagined eyes turning, whispers in the shadows, subtle gestures exchanged that I had not noticed. Everyone had played a part in maintaining the illusion of death, whether intentionally or unwittingly, and the uncertainty about their knowledge intensified my unease. Trust itself felt fragile, almost irrelevant. Every time I recalled his presence in our lives, the image of a man who smiled, who loved, who seemed gentle, collided with the growing reality that he could be a strategist, a manipulator, a man who had prepared for this exact scenario. The duality was dizzying. He had been both husband and enigma, loving yet calculating, visible yet hidden. The boundaries between what I thought I knew and what could be true were dissolving, leaving me suspended in a space where logic no longer provided comfort. I could no longer distinguish between memory and speculation. Every recollection of him was tinged with suspicion. Every shared laugh, every embrace now layered with potential intent. The man I had loved might have existed in one form, while another, darker version had operated in shadows, unseen and deliberate. If that version was alive, then vengeance was not merely possible, it was inevitable. Every person, every object, every secret had become a potential piece in a game I was only now beginning to understand, and the stakes were beyond anything I had imagined. Even the silence of the house spoke. Rooms that once held comfort now whispered warnings. The faint creak of the floorboards became the echo of steps that might never be seen. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of clocks, the distant wind brushing against windows, each became a subtle signal, a message encoded in everyday life. Life had been ordinary, but now it was a stage set for a presence that was alive, deliberate, and waiting. The certainty settled over me, heavy and suffocating. If he truly was alive, then his vengeance was not just a threat, it was a plan in motion. Every detail I had overlooked, every subtlety I had ignored, now loomed as proof that he had been ready all along. I felt trapped between the remnants of love I once believed and the terrifying knowledge that the man I mourned could still return, patient, precise, and unstoppable. The realization burned through me like fire, leaving me breathless, aware that nothing in my life would ever feel safe again. The days that followed were drenched in a strange haze, a blur where reality and imagination seemed to merge. I could no longer trust my own senses. Every creak, every shadow, every faint sound became a question, a possible sign that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Grief alone had been heavy, but now it was laced with an undercurrent of paranoia so strong that it threatened to swallow me whole. I found myself peering out of windows at passing figures, wondering if they carried knowledge I was not meant to possess, or if they were simply ordinary people unwittingly caught in the web of my fears. Even the familiar spaces of my home had changed. The living room, once a haven of warmth and comfort, now seemed charged with silent messages. A chair slightly off from its usual place, a book open where it should have been closed, a curtain swaying in a draftless room. They all became signs, clues I had to decipher. I walked through each room like an intruder in my own house, aware of every detail as if survival depended on noticing them. And perhaps in that moment, it did. I began to question everyone around me. Family, friends, neighbors. Had they seen something I had missed? Had they known more than they admitted? Their faces, once comforting, now seemed masks hiding intentions, alliances, secrets. I remembered the way my daughter had avoided my gaze at the funeral, the cold steadiness of my son-in-law, the whispers that seemed to follow every movement. The people I trusted most were suddenly strangers, their knowledge a weight I had no control over. Sleep became elusive. At night, the house seemed to breathe with me, the walls whispering secrets, the floorboards moaning under imagined footsteps. Shadows stretched and shifted in ways that felt deliberate, signaling movement I could not see. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the coffin, my grandson's whisper, the traces of my husband's presence played like a film on the inside of my eyelids. I felt trapped between reality and a nightmare I could not escape, unsure which world was true, which was fabricated, and which was waiting for me to make a wrong move. I started recalling details I had ignored for decades. The way he would disappear at odd hours, returning with a calmness that did not match the uncertainty of the night. The way he had always positioned himself in public, so he could observe without being observed, a skill that now seemed eerily prescient. Even his smiles and laughter, once comforting, now seemed like carefully placed signals, like pieces in a puzzle I had never been meant to solve. Strangers' stories returned to me, fragments that once felt inconsequential. A man in town who had spoken of my husband's temper, a neighbor who hinted at past threats, colleagues who had avoided confrontation with him. I had dismissed them all, attributing their fear to exaggeration or gossip. Now, with the possibility that he was alive, each fragment became proof of a life lived in strategy and shadow, a network of tension and influence that I had only glimpsed from the outside. Even the simplest things became charged with meaning. A misplaced cup, a folded napkin, the faint scent of tobacco in the air. They were no longer ordinary. Every detail could be a signal, a message, a marker of presence. I began cataloging them, obsessively noting every discrepancy, every irregularity, in case they were the threads of a pattern only he could recognize. And in doing so, I realized that ordinary life had become a battlefield, one where every object could hold information and every silence could be dangerous. The boundaries between truth and illusion blurred further when I noticed familiar voices behaving differently. Family members would speak in measured tones, their words precise, their gestures cautious. Neighbors who had been casual acquaintances suddenly carried an air of vigilance, as if aware of threats invisible to me. The ordinary cues I once relied on to gauge honesty and intent had dissolved, leaving me in a constant state of questioning and fear. My memories became unreliable. The man I loved, the husband I mourned, seemed to exist in fragments now, pieces that could not be trusted to reflect reality. Every affectionate touch, Every gentle word, every moment of shared laughter had been filtered through his control, through his hidden knowledge, and perhaps through his manipulation. The boundaries between what I believed and what was true had been erased. I found myself retracing every interaction with him, analyzing each with meticulous care. Did he intend to deceive me from the beginning? Had every tender moment been an instrument of control? Every gesture a carefully laid foundation for something larger? The answer eluded me, yet I could feel it pressing against my consciousness, a force too powerful to ignore. The house, the neighborhood, the world itself seemed to hum with the potential for revelation, the sense that nothing I had relied on was solid. The fear settled deeper each day, not merely as dread, but as anticipation, a constant waiting for something to emerge. Shadows moved where they should not have, voices spoke with unanticipated precision, and every familiar place felt charged with hidden meanings. My mind clung to the details, trying to parse what was real, what was illusion, and what was orchestrated by a man who might still be alive, watching the consequences of his past unfold. I began to sense that reality itself was shifting beneath me. Time felt elastic, stretching and contracting as I tried to reconcile grief, betrayal, and fear. Ordinary days became exercises in vigilance, nights in survival. And while the world moved as it always had, I moved through it differently, acutely aware that the calm surface of life could hide forces I had never imagined. Every step, every glance, every sound became significant. And in the quiet moments, when I thought I was alone, I felt it, the presence of a life that had never truly left, a force that could undo everything I had known. The house, the memories, the people, all of it was fragile, delicate, and vulnerable to revelation. And as the weight of that understanding pressed down on me, I realized that certainty had become a luxury I could no longer afford, that the world I believed I inhabited was only one layer of a reality far darker and more intricate than I had ever imagined. The house was quiet at last, but the silence no longer felt safe. Each room seemed to hold its own breath, waiting for something that might never arrive or might have already passed unseen. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. Dancing faintly in the flicker of candlelight, I lit to stave off the emptiness. Every object seemed charged. Ordinary things transformed into symbols of a life I no longer fully understood. I traced my fingers along the surfaces, half expecting them to pulse with memory, with presence, with the lingering touch of a man who might still walk among us. I thought about the coffin, the closed lid that had stood at the center of grief, and I realized how fragile our certainties are. Death is supposed to mark endings, but sometimes it only marks a pause, a momentary veil over truths that refuse to remain buried. All the rituals, the prayers, the tears, they had been both real and illusion, mourning and theater, proof that life can be both comforting and deceptive in the same instant. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, a mixture of sorrow, fear, and an eerie fascination with the hidden layers of the man I had loved. Even now, in the stillness, I could feel traces of him everywhere. A shadow moving too deliberately in the corner of my eye, a sound too measured to be mere coincidence, a memory that arrived with the precision of intention rather than recollection. He had been meticulous in life, and if the whispers were true, he remained meticulous in absence. The thought that he could orchestrate so much from beyond the reach of our knowledge was terrifying, but also strangely compelling. It made me realize how deeply influence can embed itself into the spaces we occupy, and how a single presence can define the contours of our existence, even when it is unseen. I looked at my grandson, whose small hand still held mine with unwavering certainty. He had been a witness, a keeper of truths too dangerous for most adults to confront. The bond they shared was not merely familial, it was a conduit, a transmission of knowledge that both protected and warned. I understood now that he was more than a child at a funeral. He was a custodian of legacy, a silent observer of a life crafted in shadows, and perhaps the only one capable of interpreting the signals left behind with clarity and purpose. As I wandered through the rooms one last time, I felt the stories of his life intertwining with my own. forming a tapestry that was intricate, unsettling, and beautiful in its complexity. I realized that even in absence, influence persists, and that understanding does not always come through revelation alone, but through careful observation, patience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Each object, each whisper, each memory now carried weight beyond its physical presence, a reminder that the boundaries between life, death, and legacy are often more fluid than we imagine. I thought about forgiveness and vengeance, about love and deception, about trust and betrayal. These were not simple things. They were threads that intertwined in the lives we live and the histories we inherit, shaping our perceptions of others and ourselves. The realization was overwhelming, but it also carried with it a strange kind of clarity. Life is not merely a series of moments. It is a landscape of decisions, secrets, and consequences that ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. In that quiet, I felt a sense of closure tempered by the lingering presence of questions. The man I loved may have been gone, or he may have simply stepped beyond the reach of ordinary sight. His influence remained, invisible yet undeniable, shaping the space around me and the minds of those who had been closest to him. And in acknowledging that, I understood that endings are rarely absolute. They are portals to reflection, revelation, and sometimes preparation for the challenges we are yet to face. Even as the night pressed down, heavy and still, there was a sliver of hope threading through my awareness. The resilience of memory, the courage to question, the instinct to observe, they were all tools I had cultivated unknowingly, preparing me for a reality that could shift at any moment. I recognized that my life, though shaken, was not without agency. I could choose how to navigate the consequences of secrets, how to protect those I loved, and how to honor what was real amidst uncertainty. And so, with the house silent and the shadows stretching long, I allowed myself a final quiet breath. I had walked through grief, deception, and fear, and I had emerged with a deeper understanding of the fragile architecture of life and trust. I knew now that vigilance, awareness, and love were intertwined in ways I had never appreciated. The story of a man who may or may not have returned would remain etched in memory, a reminder of the power of presence and the enduring complexity of human lives. Thank you for witnessing this journey with me. If you felt the tension, the secrets, and the mysteries that unfolded, then you know how fragile truth can be and how potent a whisper can become. The next video on your screen holds more stories that will test your perception, challenge your assumptions, and draw you even deeper into worlds where nothing is as it seems. Click now to continue the journey and discover the next story that will captivate and enthrall you from the very first second.